line, we have a very interesting panel discussion. It's about investments in energy infrastructure. In order for the renewable energy transformation to successfully take place, we need a resilient grid, functioning power plants and generators, and a strong network of pipelines and interconnectors. Makes sense. In this panel discussion, you will hear how the energy industry is providing the funds in order to bolster energy infrastructure while guaranteeing returns for its stakeholders, and how we can funnel more capital into this crucial area. We're still taking a few more people in, starting in just a minute. Just out of my own curiosity, by a show of hands, how many people were attending yesterday, day one? Yeah, that's good. And you're still here, so must be interesting. I was here the whole day. I have to say, best conversations I've had for a while. So please welcome to the stage our moderator, Elena Pravettoni from Clean Power Lead, Energy Transition Commission, David Richardson, Head of Innovation from Ofgem Strategic Innovation Fund, UKRI, Mark McKean,
please, thank you very much.
Head of Offshore Assets, Crown Estate Scotland, and Rob Rome, Commercial Director of National Grid Ventures. Also, Richard Sargent, Senior Hydrogen Regulatory and Funding Manager.
Thanks.
Start. You can start.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to our session today on investments in energy infrastructure. My name is Elena Pravettoni, and I am the Clean Power Lead at the Energy Transitions Commission. So it's a pleasure to be moderating this fantastic panel today. We've got expertise across a different set of energy technologies and across public and private entities. And we're here to talk about what we really need to do to unlock investments and projects for the energy transition, to the clean technologies that we need to move to a system based on cheap, clean energy from generation to storage to grids. So before kicking off the discussion, I will turn to each of the panelists to give a quick introduction with the name, where they're from, and what they focus on. Over to you, Mark.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark McKean. I'm Head of Offshore Assets for our energy and infrastructure business at Crown Estate Scotland. At Crown Estate Scotland, we invest in property, natural resources and people to generate lasting value for Scotland. And what does that look like in the offshore space? We do two main things. We lease offshore rights for various technologies, for offshore renewables, and then we work with those developers who have those rights to see those projects built out and operating. Also work more broadly with industry groups and bodies, work with government, other stakeholders that have an interest in the offshore space from an energy generation perspective to sustain and increase the confidence in seeing these projects built out. From an offshore wind perspective, which is a fairly big focus for us, at the moment in construction or in operation, we've got just about under 4 gigawatts of wind projects, and then followed by a fairly strong pipeline of development projects in offshore wind, totaling about 39 gigawatts. You may have heard of our ScotWind commercial offshore wind leasing round in Scottish waters, and also our innovation and targeted oil and gas leasing round for offshore wind as well, the first dedicated offshore wind leasing round that includes supporting decarbonisation of oil and gas production in the North Sea. In addition to offshore wind, our interests are in wave and tidal technology, and in Scotland we've got the largest operating fleet of wave and tidal projects. I'm really proud of that, and a real sense of knowledge and expertise in that sector. And we also host in Scotland the European Marine Energy Centre, EMEC, up in Orkney, which is the foremost testing facility for wave and tidal technologies in the world. I'll leave it at that.
Hello everyone, so my name's Rob Rome. I work for the National Grid interconnectors business, and we've got 8 gigawatts of point-to-point interconnectors with Norway, Denmark, France, Belgium and Holland. And I think we're probably the biggest portfolio now transmission connected in the UK with 8 gigawatts. And some of you might have seen that our latest interconnector went live on the 29th of December last year, and that was the one with Denmark. And of course what we do is we sell capacity on these interconnectors, so a whole bunch of energy participants come along and they buy capacity, and then they decide whether to flow electricity from, where there's a surplus, where there's a low price, and they'll flow electricity across our 8 gigawatts of interconnectors to the country that's got the higher price. And we're quite proud of our existing portfolio, because if you look at the electricity system operators winter outlook for the winter just gone, the UK required about 5 gigawatts of interconnector imports to give its average electricity surplus margin of 4.1 gigawatts. We've also got interests in producing what are called offshore hybrid assets, and these are again interconnectors connecting 2 countries, but also facilitating and connecting offshore wind in the middle of those interconnectors. So we've got 2 pilot projects that we'll probably touch on during the course of this panel. One is Lion Link, and that's a connection facilitating offshore wind with the Netherlands, and another one is Nautilus, again facilitating offshore wind and connecting to Belgium, trying very much to enable this energy transition. My role at the interconnectors business is the commercial customer and regulation director. Nice to see you all.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Sargent from RWE Generation. So you may be familiar with the name. RWE provides around 15% of the UK's power, and we own and operate a pretty diverse portfolio of energy assets, so onshore wind, offshore wind, hydro, biomass, solar, gas, and we very much hope to become a producer of green hydrogen. So across our core markets, which is Germany, UK, Netherlands, the company is aiming to produce 2 gigawatts of green hydrogen by 2030. My particular role within the company sits in the UK hydrogen team, where we have a business development function, a project development function, commercial function. My particular role is on the policy and regulatory side. So that's looking at the policy landscape. How does it work for green hydrogen production? Where do we need to make changes, improvements? So lots of interface with key government department, DESNZ, and of course the wider stakeholder base within both public and private sector. And we're very keen to produce green hydrogen in a number of locations in the country, and that's what we're focused on doing. So my role in terms of infrastructure and investment in that infrastructure that we're talking about today is very much from that angle. What do we need as a producer of green hydrogen to enable scaling up the business? We are looking at projects at the larger end of production at this early stage of the hydrogen economy. Infrastructure is going to be vital, looking ahead to continuing that market, making it sustainable and growing at scale.
My name is David Richardson. I'm Head of Innovation at Innovate UK for the delivery of the Ofgem Strategic Innovation Fund. It's a £450 million innovation investment fund which is really geared towards the regulated gas and electricity networks. And I think for the purposes of this conversation, we're not just interested in how we unlock investment in our core energy network infrastructure, but as you've undoubtedly been hearing over the last day, really now the energy network infrastructure within the UK is the key part of the puzzle, which is preventing and facilitating the rollout of other low carbon technologies as well. So really our focus is how do we develop the new technologies, but not just hardware, it's software as well, and process innovation. We're increasingly finding that we need to evolve the way that our system consents and plans and models the system to be able to unlock commercially viable and financeable innovations from EV charging right the way through to large-scale offshore wind farms, hydrogen production, and everything in between that needs to connect to the system, really.
Thanks very much, everyone. So we'll definitely get to cover a broad range of technologies here. Let's just step back for some quick context. So where we stand today is that we have a very clear direction of travel. We know that a net zero trajectory means shifting to a system based primarily on massive clean electrification, and we are advancing on a number of fronts. In 2023, global renewable capacity additions increased by almost 50% to 500 gigawatts. That's the 22nd consecutive year of that record setting and the fastest growth rate in decades. But we also know that behind that headline number, there are different trends across different technologies. The wind story is different to the solar story. We know that we're still in the early stages of clean hydrogen development. And we also know that on the network side, we need to double the size of grids by 2050 in net zero trajectories. Yet today, there are 1,500 gigawatts of projects in advanced stages sitting in connection queues around the world. So kind of with that context, I'd like to turn it over to the panelists to really focus on what are some of the barriers that they're seeing to the deployment. And let me start with you, Mark. What do you see as some of the biggest blockers on the offshore wind side?
I think starting from a high level in terms of where we're at on the sort of ambition and our targets, I see in currently Scotland as part of the landscape of energy in Scotland. You probably have seen the last couple of days that we're now recognising that we won't meet our 2030 targets to get to 2045, and that's been said publicly by the Scottish Government. We recognise that it's just really difficult to do. There's telling anyone here that, probably aware of that. But stepping down to the sector that I'm going to talk about in terms of offshore wind, within the UK, we are targeting 30 gigawatts by 2030 as part of what we're looking at our immediate ambitions. How are we doing on that? By my estimation, we've got just under 12 gigawatts in operation and just under 8 in construction at the moment. So 22.5 gigawatts that is either about to operate or operating at the moment. And then over the next couple of years, what's going to get built out to allow us to achieve those targets. The contracts for different arrangements, allocation round 6, which I think the window for that closed for those kind of interested in it in the last couple of days, in the last week or so. Allocation round 6 developers are telling us that it's probably realistically achievable. They'll get somewhere between 3 and 5 gigawatts out of that. So that's 22 plus 5, 27 gigawatts. Are we going to get to 30 gigawatts by 2030? Not sure. There's a challenge there. And I think there are a number of barriers to that for us. Undoubtedly, one of those is going to be grid, and I'm sure we will talk more detailed about the grid challenges. But there's a number of barriers that have been identified by the wind industry over the last couple of years. Probably highlight the Prime Minister's Offshore Wind Champions report that was published by Tim Pick a while ago. It highlighted a number of areas where we can improve. And if you're involved in the wind sector, you'll be aware of that piece of work. And there's a number of challenges around about grid, around about supply chain, around about consenting, kind of all the areas that we know are challenges on development. And I don't think that there's one single thing. I think grid's probably a big one, and supply chain actually, for us in terms of meeting our ambitions to get to 2030 and have achieved 30 gigawatts.
Yeah. No, we'll come back to unpack some of those later. But Richard, can I ask, on the hydrogen side, what do you see as some of the biggest barriers there? Is grid, supply chains we heard, do those sort of, are there any of those that are sort of in common with the big barriers you're seeing?
Absolutely. I think the first point to make on hydrogen is that compared to wind and indeed other clean energy technologies, hydrogen's pretty new. So when we talk about challenges, there should be an expectation that they will be there. It's not necessarily a negative thing to say, oh, this is all really, really difficult. I think actually, for any nascent technology, overcoming those barriers is part of the early stage. I also think it's worth saying that when you look at the policy and regulatory framework for hydrogen production, that's in a pretty good place, actually. There's good ambition from government, and they've specified up to 10 gigawatts of low-carbon hydrogen capacity by 2030. There is a subsidy mechanism in place to support the production of that hydrogen in the form of the production business model, which is largely considered by developers and investors to be a bankable model. And that has seen, I think it's 11 projects announced in the first hydrogen allocation round, so that applies to green hydrogen production, 125 megawatts of capacity. And the second allocation round, which is targeting 875 megawatts of capacity, has just closed and is oversubscribed. And so actually we're in a fairly healthy position when we come to production. Now, the model for that early on in the growth of the hydrogen economy is that hydrogen is produced and supplied to an off-taker in pretty close proximity. And why is that? Because we don't yet have the infrastructure to move the hydrogen very far. So that's where you come to the first barrier. After a while, producers can make hydrogen, give it over the fence to an off-taker. We'll run out of projects doing it like that, and that's not investable. It's not a sustainable market. You have to have the infrastructure in place. So the transportation infrastructure via pipe and the storage infrastructure, largely geological storage in the first instance, available to developers. And that's how you move the hydrogen geographically and you time shift it by using storage. Then the market is opened up. That's how you make your first really big step towards a liquid market for hydrogen, which is not to be confused with a liquid hydrogen market. Get my words in the right order. And the reason that I would describe it as a barrier, it's perhaps a little bit harsh, but it's behind production. And so in terms of government policy making, they're doing quite a lot to design different business models to support both transport and storage infrastructure projects. They're hoping to allocate the first awards for those, I think, early 2025. So they've brought the timetable forward, but there's no room for slippage in that timetable, and there's still quite a lot of uncertainty. And we'll talk about planning, I'm sure, in a bit later, but there's a lot of uncertainty around how the planning of that infrastructure is going to work. How does that relate to which transport and storage projects you ultimately fund? Where are they going to be? And as I intimated at the start, for a producer of hydrogen, we need confidence that we know where the storage is going to be, we know where the pipes are going to be, and that we can connect to those assets. Otherwise, we don't have a route to scale up. And so that's the sort of the first one I'd identify. I won't talk much now about grid because I'm sure that we'll come on to that, but that is certainly a barrier to hydrogen. And for lots of technologies, grid connections are difficult to come by, let us say, putting it politely. And that is a concern because that is a risk, thinking about it as a hydrogen developer, that is outside our control. So we can have a good project, deliverable project, secure offtake, but if we can't connect to the grid within the delivery window specified by government to mean that they will support the project, then we don't have a project. And if you're an investor, and a developer talking to an investor, the developer just maybe starts to think, or the investor starts to think, we don't have deliverable projects here, and the money starts to look elsewhere. So that's certainly one that I would flag, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that a little bit more. There are lots more, but I'll pause there.
So turning to you, Rob, in the interconnector space, it'd be great to hear a little bit about the sort of ambition and the vision that we should be kind of seeing in that space. And then again, what are some of the challenges? We've talked a little bit about some of the build issues, I suppose. is there anything also on the sort of market design or regulatory frameworks that you see?
Yep, it's a good question. At the moment, we're working on these pilot projects. So these are transmission connections connecting two different countries, but also facilitating the connection of offshore wind. And we're working with regulator and government right now to put in place policy and regulations, commercial arrangements that don't currently exist. So, and that's very challenging because let me sort of bring it to life a little. In the old world, you would build a point-to-point interconnector, and for example, the one that went live in December, Viking Link with Denmark, there was National Grid on this side, there was Energinet, the Danish transmission system operator, on the other side, who would do a deal, split everything 50-50, get regulator and government approval, and do the deal. Everything's 50-50. Just like that nice meal you had in the restaurant where nobody tried to itemize the bill and pay for that Diet Coke because you had a pint of Stella. No, I didn't. But now it's much more complicated because you've got an offshore wind developer in the middle. You've got your two transmission system operators. You've got two governments. You've got two regulators. You've got 7 people in that room trying to negotiate a deal. And it gets really complicated because, which country's exporting, which one's importing, how much of the transmission capacity is the wind farm consuming, how much isn't it consuming, and so on. And the regulators, of course, are quite rightly looking at protecting the consumers, because if you export from one country, you raise the price of electricity for the exporting country, and you reduce it in the importing country. And it gets really, really complicated. So right now, we have a huge ambition to facilitate offshore wind and continue to, in line with the interconnector strategy that the government has, to connect countries. And we want to do that, but it gets very, very complicated. And you can call these barriers and blockers, and there are barriers and blockers everywhere. But I think having the right mindset, to create a solution, and to put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're trying to negotiate with. Try and understand their position. If you put yourself in their shoes, would you be happy with what you were asking them to commit to? And I think if we have that mindset with the 7 parties in the room, I think we can do it. But as I say, it's a blocker at the moment because these policies and regulations, cost and revenue sharing arrangements don't exist currently. We're writing those as we progress.
Yeah. No, and we'll definitely kind of touch on some of the solutions as well. But over to you, Dave. You sort of have a broader portfolio. What do you, again, see as some of the challenges and the different interests, or kind of navigating, some of the financing and regulatory frameworks? What do you kind of see as the major challenges across areas?
So we run a process on an annual cycle of really going around to energy sector participants and finding out what are the real world problems that they're facing with rolling out infrastructure and making low carbon technology deployments. The last 2 years, the overarching one that has come back again and again is connections are taking too long, they're too expensive, and we're getting... I spoke to one person who was given a timeline of 18 years before they get their grid connection, which is just, it's crazy, right? We can't deal with that. To give some of the viewpoint on the figures for the power system in particular, so the connections queue topped out at over 700 gigawatts of capacity in the connections queue last year. To put that in perspective, the National Grid Future Energy scenarios forecast in the maximum scenario that we're going to need about 160 gigawatts of capacity in 2050. There's about 115 gigawatts of storage in the connection queue as well. So we're practically able to cover 70% of 2050 capacity by the storage which is in the connection queue. This begs the question, what's the problem? Right? I can tell from an advocate's perspective, when they're looking at this picture, you've got the projects, get the job done. Let's get these clean assets rolled out, connected, and solve this problem as quickly as possible. When you dig deeper into what the issues are there, a lot of these projects aren't commercially viable, quite frankly. So they're sitting in the connections queue holding other things up. Many of them aren't in the places where we actually need the capacity. So there's no point us developing a huge bottleneck in one part of the country and then being unable to shift it to where it is. And then to touch on the point of what makes these commercially viable and financeable, is I think we've touched on this point in several parts of the panel already, is increasingly we're needing to look at multi-party arrangements to make some of these projects viable. We're starting to understand that with some of the standardized assets. So storage assets are really starting to have to stack their revenues. But it really applies across a whole range of things to really be able to facilitate large-scale clean power production. We need to start look at how we start coupling that with green hydrogen production. Where do we store that green hydrogen? And then you start to get into a much more complicated picture where you've got multi-organizations which are each trying to get a slice of the pie which works for them. And it needs to come up with new, novel commercial business models to be able to deliver that in an environment where interest rates are higher than they have been in a long time. And also as we move to a system where energy is becoming more a commodity than it ever has been before. So quite frankly, it's a relatively low returns investment compared to a lot of other investments as well.
Yeah. So just as you touched on the interest rates, I wanted to ask, with this sort of potentially situation of higher for longer on interest rates, have we reset to this new environment? What does that sort of mean across the board? I don't know if anyone would like to start on that in particular?
Well, shall I say something quickly from the perspective of a hydrogen producer? I mean, I think that clearly cost is a huge issue, and we know that as a developer in building up our costs for a production project, we will have to take on higher costs within the supply chain. That's inevitable, and that's something that we need to manage. I suppose the thing that we worry about in that context is that there's that pressure on the one side, and then on the other side, coming from government, who developers at this stage rely on for funding, there's a huge downward pressure on costs. And so the question is as much, I think, to put to a government person who isn't on the panel, is how is government dealing with that challenge? And I think it's a really tricky one. I think the government has acknowledged, when they're looking at hydrogen production, that you cannot move too quickly, for example, to a cost-competitive allocation. That was their intention, to move to that fairly soon, and I think we won't see competitive price auctions, if that's what they use, until 2028. But nonetheless, in future allocation rounds for green hydrogen, there's a huge expectation that costs come down. HAR 1 prices, strike prices already are expected to be lower in HAR 2, and when you then look at the inflationary pressures in the supply chain and factoring that in, that's quite difficult. I don't know how much this would stray into supply chains more broadly, so I'll just make one very brief comment. At the same time, there is also an expectation building that if you're developing a UK project, you should use UK supply chain. So, and that's a laudable ambition, and it's part of industrial policy that any government these days will want to push forward. But then again, you've got the costs associated with that on top of escalating costs in general, which is another dynamic to manage from a producer's point of view.
Great, no, thank you. And I think that definitely that balance between putting that pressure on cost, but also recognizing dynamics in the supply chain and in the financing environment is one that we need to work across different technologies. I wanted to touch on the question of skills. No one has mentioned, whether the question, I guess, yes, do we have the right skills in our workforce? Is anyone worried about that?
Yes.
Yes.
The simple answer. from an innovation project investment perspective, what we really try and drive people to think about these things at the early stages of project development now, which it used to be, let's focus on the technology development, bring it up the technology readiness level, scale, and then we'll work out how the commercial arrangements work, and then we'll work out how we're actually going to roll this out and the whole skills agenda associated with it. That just needs to be developed right from the start now. It needs to start being looked at, right, what are the skills that we require here? Where are we going to get them? Where are we competing with them? And you are starting to see companies, so you know, Octopus have now got their heat pump installer training centre and are really starting to try and ramp up that so that they can meet demand as it comes. But I mean, the rest of the panel will know better than I do that it's starting to bite with a lot of different parts of the sector now.
Yeah. I can say something on that.
Yeah.
I think from an offshore wind perspective, given the scale and ambition that we've got within the UK and within Scotland as well, I know that there's a really kind of early focus and spotlight on the area of skills. So at UK level, OWIC, the Offshore Wind Industry Council, recognised that by 2030 we're talking about 100,000 jobs by 2030 that is expected or needed in terms of delivering the deployment that we're looking at the moment. So that's a significant number in and of itself. From our perspective in Scotland, we have there's a collaboration of government and industry called the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, and it's actually set up, and it's one of the parts of his founding vision was about development of a highly skilled workforce. That's a commitment that they wanted to do, recognizing that there is a transition element from some other sectors. So from a Scottish perspective, really interested to see that transition from the oil and gas sector in terms of the skills and the workforce, often referred to within government circles as the just transition. So helping people move their skills base from maybe an adjacent sector into the offshore wind sector, and also to ensure that pool of jobs and opportunities in the future is highly diverse and highly open to everyone who's got something to bring to the offshore wind sector. I think it's fair to say that we will not be able to deliver the projects that we need to deliver if we don't have the people and the skills at that scale. And also recognizing that we're talking about not just out to 2030, we're talking about to 2040, 2050, and we'll maybe come on to where projects might be. We'll maybe go back to grid and supply chain, because those are probably kind of ongoing challenges. We need to be engaging with schools, colleges, universities at that level now, so that we're seeing professionals that are going to come into this industry in 10, 15 years' time. And that's exciting, be able to say that people that are in education at the moment can have a job that makes a difference in an industry that is making a difference, and actually is a world leader within UK export opportunities in the future as well.
Hey, Mark, whilst we're on it, so something that's less talked about is efficiency of how we deliver all of this as well. And I imagine less so in the offshore wind sector, but for instance, I've been out in the van with a smart meter installer. Some of the things that happen on a day-to-day basis is incredible. You turn up at a property, it turns out that the meter box is just somewhere completely different and there's not the equipment to be able to do it. That's wasted one person 2 hours of their time. Another analogy, this isn't an energy problem, but I've been getting my broadband cable attempted to be changed at my house recently. I've had about 8 visits where people have turned up and said, oh, I can't do this for whatever reason. This is just going on all over the place. The construction sector, in particular, in the British economy, is one of the lowest productivity sectors going, and we need to start harnessing smarter ways of deploying and using our workforce to their full capacity as well.
I mean, you're right. People are everything, aren't they? If you look at every success that you've had at work, it's because of those, really great people that you've had working on it, and also the organisation, being well organised, good culture, and nice environment, and with all of that comes that extra that extra will to put the effort in, and to get the project over the line to get that great outcome. So it's people, good systems, processes, get these good outcomes. And you've got to invest in people. I mean, at the interconnectors business, we're putting a lot of investment into apprentices. I was an apprentice myself. If you don't train them from, the grassroots in the new world, we're focusing a lot on HVDC because that's the technology of our converter stations and our subsea cables. And these are in finite supply in terms of people skills. And then when you look at the scale of the challenge, what we're actually trying to do, not just as the UK, but as Europe and the whole world, we need these people. And we need them already. We don't have them. And so we need to train them. So I think companies need to put their money where their mouth is and get these young people involved and retrain people because they're our best asset.
Absolutely.
There's just two quick observations I'd make. One is thinking about it from a hydrogen perspective. As we've said, it's a new industry. Now that has skills and resource challenges itself, and we're talking here today about infrastructure and the link to investment. And I think that one of our concerns in the hydrogen industry is that actually when it comes to planning and consenting projects, there isn't that level of expertise. So if you look into local authority planning departments or you look into the teams in the various regulatory bodies that need to oversee this process, hydrogen is new to them. And so actually finding people who have the knowledge and expertise to support a quick planning process, if such a thing exists for energy infrastructure anyway, is really quite difficult. And so I think that that's acknowledged, but that's definitely a challenge when it comes to skills. And my other quick comment is that taking it up a level to sort of energy-wide, I think that is a really important angle. So you can have individual technologies that might do some very detailed analysis and try and solve for particular skill problems that they may face. But actually, so many of the skills that we need for the clean energy transition are generic skills that can be applied to different technologies. And so if you're not thinking about that overall picture, you risk having a situation, and we have seen this, where you have certain technologies that are perhaps more established and developed than others are stealing all the good engineers. And you risk a bidding war where the highest bidder gets the best people. And for some technologies, there's a regional angle to this, actually not really for hydrogen, but I know from experience of looking at the nuclear sector, they used to worry about how they were going to attract people to particular parts of the country because they're quite remote, and there's lots and lots of things that you don't immediately think of as a challenge when it comes to skills, particularly when you need to get young, talented, well-qualified people into all these sectors to achieve the clean energy transition. It needs that big picture thinking as well as solving for technology-specific skills gaps as well.
Yes, and thanks, Richard, for touching also on the issue of sufficiently staffing permitting departments. I think that the planning and permitting challenges have been something we've looked at as well in the ETC. I think some of our analysis looking at offshore wind in the UK showed that if it currently takes 12 years to do the planning and permitting process for a project, we believe we can actually get that down to 5.5 years, so halving that, if we sort of take action across the regulatory barriers, the administrative barriers, and societal support, including, again, this issue of staffing departments. So that's an interesting link there. I think I'd like now to turn to a little bit more of the solutions, or what we need to do to really get through these barriers. And one area where I'd like to sort of get the panel's input on is the strategic vision. Do we have that right strategic vision, that coordinated view? And what do you think we need, do you see as a critical aspect of that? And maybe we'll start with you, Rob, on the beyond country vision as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important. First thing you should start off with is a vision, a strategy, and then crucially a plan, strategic plan. And I don't know if you've seen ENTSO-E, the European network of transmission system owners came out with a blueprint for the offshore network development plan right across Europe. But crucially, it's a really great document, and a really great strategy and a great plan of how to meet European targets. Didn't involve the UK so much, post-Brexit, made some assumptions on how the UK would play a part in Europe's network strategy and offshore wind build-out strategy. So that's not so good. But then the electricity system operator in GB, they came out with their own Beyond 2030 plan. A huge plan to spend 58 billion, creating more transmission through the centre of the country, lots of subsea cables mainly on the east, but some on the west, in order to get Scottish and offshore wind to where it needs to be consumed by demand by homes, businesses in GB. So another great step. So 2 blueprints. And wouldn't it be great if those 2 blueprints came together and were sequenced in a really great way? And that's, I think, the next step to make sure that all the right people are around the same table, creating plans, having the same vision, same strategy, and not do it in too much of a piecemeal way. Now, we at National Grid Interconnectors think we can play a big role here by helping to bridge any gaps that these 2 plans have. But I think we should be optimistic that we do have these plans, and we can all work to make sure that they come together in the right way.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, when I was thinking about this, I was sort of scribbling down the names of lots of plans with the word strategy in them, and you're absolutely right, Rob. I mean, those are coming, and I mean, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on the new national energy system operator that is coming into force later this year. Huge responsibility on their shoulders, and perhaps we can touch on that if we've got time, because it's quite significant, I think. And I suppose that we will look at those plans, and they're looking at the right questions in terms of how you plan the grid and the various technologies that will need to connect into that from a whole systems approach. But it's an enormous challenge, and so the question really is, how do those things come together? Mm-hmm. And then you look at, you've got various infrastructure reviews that are going on and may feed into this. We've got a Lord Banner review going on at the moment. Labour did their own review through Darren Jones, the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and how do they kind of feed into this? And there's just so much that's being thought about, but at this stage, it's hard to see how it all comes together, and I think that's the key, really, that it's all joined up.
And I think there needs to be a recognition of, I do have a lot of sympathy, because part of our role is to extract the learnings and technology insights from projects and present them to policymakers and regulators. I often feel like the conversation turns to, we need you to make a decision to provide certainty on this. And the reality is, it's a trilemma of its own. It's technology development needs to drive down costs so that it's easier to make those decisions. Financiers need to be able to assess their risk appetite and what sort of strategy they want to be making these large-scale investments. And then it provides the policymakers with the room to maneuver around those decisions and bring them forward a little bit. And I think we could all start looking at it a lot more in that collective responsibility point of view, so that we are able to accelerate these things along.
From an offshore wind perspective, I think that I agree with all of what the rest of the panel has said in terms of a joined-up approach. Absolutely. I think we'll wait and see what the future system operator brings in terms of the grid questions. From our perspective, the asset we have is the seabed, and actually we need to take a long-term view of how we use that as well. Why is that important in this discussion? You talked about 12 years, I think you mentioned. You would bring them down to 5.5 for consenting an offshore wind farm. Our experience is it takes 10 to 12 years from a project being conceived to it being constructed and operating from an offshore wind perspective. That's 2 political cycles and a reasonable amount of patience through that development pathway. So from our perspective, whenever it comes to offshore development, whether it be offshore wind, whether it be offshore grid, which is going to be a key part of our integrated grid in the future, whether it be interconnectors with other countries, whether it be kind of development of wave and tidal technologies, which we're interested in, carbon capture and storage, which is another area. The seabed is actually becoming much more crowded, and people are starting to define it as the marine squeeze. We need to have a view as to what policymakers' priorities are in the longer term, so that we can make the right strategic decisions for all these technologies. Or actually, from a net zero perspective, what about just leaving the embodied carbon in the seabed and not developing anything there? So a long-term approach is important, and having a long-term certainty and a view from policymakers and government in terms of what we want to do with this. So certainty and visibility is what investors need, because it takes them a long time to develop the projects they're involved in.
Yeah, thank you. We have some audience questions, but just before we turn to those, I'd like to end with a very quick round to ask, if you had to choose one, what is the top of your wish list in terms of an ask to either policymakers or industry to really, get this right? What sits at the top? And maybe we'll go down, so starting with you, Dave.
Sort out the planning and consenting process by whatever means necessary. And I think there are points about having the right skills and the right organisations to do that. Actually, there was a big review of the whole planning process within the UK to sort of cut the red tape. And it was actually found that a lot of these planning processes, there's good reason for them, and we wouldn't want to chuck them in the bin. So finding a way that people can really easily navigate them and then have confidence over having a decision in a reasonable timeline is what I'd really like to see.
I think grid has to be grid. And the main reason there is that, thinking selfishly as a developer of hydrogen production projects, it's a risk, as I said earlier, it's a risk that's outside our control. And you can have plans for a really good, deliverable, value for money project and be scuppered by grid. And so, the government knows that, right? It's not a new issue, and that there are action plans in place. There is work being done to address this problem, but it really, really does need to come together quite quickly. And it's not just a hydrogen problem, as we've identified, but some of the other infrastructure challenges that I mentioned in terms of building pipes and storage, it feels like there is a process in place to make that happen. And actually, the more hydrogen that you start to produce, the more, if you're a TNS project developer, you see that there's the potential for a market for your services. Whereas I think grid is something that just really does need to be gripped and quickly.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's that saying, isn't there? A good decision made quickly is better than a perfect decision made really, really slowly. And I think, all having that mindset where we do make progress, we don't seek perfection. We have to be careful that, consumers and businesses get the right deal. But I think, having the proper mindset to make really, really strong progress as quickly as possible and aim for these targets, I think that's what I would ask industry, policymakers, decision makers.
Can we take a slightly different tack? I think supply chains are really important in terms of the ask. Reasons for that is because having a good, solid supply chain de-risks us in the global marketplace. We're already seeing that from an offshore wind perspective. I think it probably applies to all the sectors that are being talked about today. Prices will go up if there's less people able to offer the goods and services that we need to develop the projects that we have. It's really clear. But the win-win for this is, if we do the solid work to develop our supply chain in the UK, we get to see the economic benefit. And that has to be a good thing for everyone. It has to be a good thing for our politicians. It has to be a good thing for longevity of the sector and also that export opportunity. And I know the offshore wind sector is doing quite a bit on that, and maybe for another time.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. So turning now to one of the questions from the audience. There's one, should we be worried about stranded assets? And this is basically saying, if we need to move quickly to meet our targets, that will require sort of a shift in the investment framework, thinking about anticipatory, taking some bold decisions. And I guess the question is that something that the risk of over-delivery, how do we balance that? And are stranded assets a concern?
I could start with that one. I remember back in, was it 2015, when we built the Western Bootstrap, which was down the west-hand side, Scotland to England, to facilitate Scottish wind. A great decision. There was an Eastern Bootstrap in the plan as well. Wasn't taken forward because of the, is now, but wasn't then taken forward because of the risk of stranded assets. We have to be mindful of stranded assets, but for me, if you look at where the wind resources are, in the UK, and if you look at where the main demand centres are, you should have a view on where new demand centres should be. But I think you have to be bold. You have to act quickly. And a stranded asset, if the energy crisis showed us anything, could actually provide the UK with some redundancy and some resilience to scenarios or outcomes that we never thought could happen, but can happen. And so I think we should look at the risk of stranded assets through the lens of, what redundancy does it give us to cope with new world events? We have to look after consumers, but if we're not careful, we do let it stop our progression in meeting targets and giving consumers what they want, which is a decarbonised and secure electricity supply.
What needs to be joined up with that as well, and we are lacking terribly at the moment, is some form of coherent industrial strategy. The risk of stranded assets is only elevated when we don't know if we're really going to pursue heavy industry in certain parts of the country. People don't want to be signing up to contracts which are going to be 20 years long and then find out that they've deployed their whole business around energy costs which are completely shaky and unreasonable as well. And hopefully that's something that will come in the next election cycle, but it's certainly lacking at the moment, I'd say.
Great. Then there's a question, I think, for you, Richard, on the role of hydrogen for power.
I think that's all the time we have for questions, I'm afraid.
We'll leave it at that then. All right, thank you.
Perfect timing.
Continue the conversation.
Yeah, whoever asked that, come. We've got our stand just over there, so just come and have a chat.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for the discussion and for being with us.